Hello and welcome back to the port. I'm the Gallic Major, and this is a What is the Washington Naval Treaty? So in recent Let's Plays, the Aoba and the Pensacola, we've mentioned things such as the Washington Naval Treaty, and so hopefully this is going to be a quick What is the Naval Treaty guide. Basically, after the First World War, the Allied powers negotiated limitations on naval expansion and naval design. The reason being was to try and stop the next naval arms race, because leading up to the First World War, the Royal Navy was based on a two-power navy. That basically meant that the size of the Royal Navy was based on the sum of the two next largest powers, and hence the Royal Navy was then the largest navy in the world. So there was a bit of a naval arms race with Germany building battleships and then Britain building twice as many, and it got a bit nuts, really, I guess you could say. So following that, you got to see that America has kind of come to the table and has now got quite a large navy. Japan has been growing for quite a while now, especially following the Anglo-Japanese Treaty, in which, let's just say, the Congo-class battle cruisers, the first one's built in Britain, and then it sails over to Japan, and then Japan builds more. So just remember that when you're playing Congo in the game, you're playing a British battleship. Thank you. So Japan's growing, and then Britain, she's war weary. She's lost quite a lot of units. The units obviously haven't been maintained properly. Some of them really were just built for the sake of it. I mean, just look at Furious and Glorious and Courageous. And then when they're in their cruiser design, I should say, before their carriers, when they're cruisers, you got two of them have two 15-inch guns in two turrets, and then one of them's got one 18-inch gun in one turret, fore and aft. So it's just silly. I don't know why they built them, really. And so you've got those kind of things, really. So all these nations are coming to the table, and it's basically almost just try and like make peace for the future, stop the next naval arms race. And so Britain accepts parity with the United States. Japan unwillingly accepts a tonnage which is a bit more than half of what the Americans and the British are allowed. And then other nations like France and Italy begrudgingly accept a very low tonnage. So it's not, I wouldn't say everyone's a happy bunny following the treaty, but it's signed and it is put into effect, I guess you could say. So some of the quick things that you can just take away from it is that there's a 10-year pause on the production of capital ships. So basically none of these nations are allowed to build any new battleships for the next 10 years, from 1922 to 1932. So that's in effect. However, there's a clause that we'll get back to. Now there's also a limitation on tonnage. So it means large navies like the Royal Navy needs to actually reduce in size in order to squeeze within that tonnage. So that means you're looking at some of the older ships, very old ships, being decommissioned and scrapped. But then there's also an allowance that says that any ships that are retained within this tonnage can have guns up to 16 inches. The reason why that's there is because America and Japan have just built the Colorado and Nagato classes, and so one of the things that Britain negotiates is, well, you've got these new battleships literally coming off the slipways as we're negotiating this. America's getting 3, Japan's getting 2. Can we have 2 battleships that we can build that will fit within the treaty limitations? Therefore, guns no more than 16 inches and will count towards the total displacement of the battleship fleet. That's kind of agreed, and Britain builds Nelson and Rodney in the early 20s, basically between 1922 and 1927. So that's like the capital unit side. Now there's a bit on cruisers, and I think that's the big thing, because with the battleship side of it, so there's a 10-year holiday that takes you to 1932. Well, what happens in 1932? We got the Great Depression, so everyone's bankrupt again. No one really wants to build anything, so purse strings are quite tight. But during this time, so from the 20s and the 30s, cruisers are limited by a 10,000 ton limit, which is quite an interesting way. And then they're also limited in gun caliber, so no more than 8-inch guns. Now this is then refined in the London Naval Treaty of 1930, and this basically, I mean, it's not as effective because eventually Japan and Italy withdraw from this agreement, but it is signed and agreed, and this agreement basically covers things like submarines and destroyers, smaller vessels like sloops, minesweepers, corvettes, frigates, I guess you could do whatever you want to call them, but also it covers cruisers again, and this is where the specification is that if it's 6 inches or less gun caliber and within the 10,000 tons, it's a light cruiser, and then if it's 8 inches guns within the 10,000 ton limit, then it's a heavy cruiser. Now, what these two treaties mean is basically, especially from the Washington Naval Treaty, when it comes to battleships, it's a issue of make do and mend. So that means what you see is quite a lot of battleships are modernized. Things like the Fuso class, the Congo class, Arizona and her sisters, the Queen Elizabeth class, like Queen Elizabeth and Warspite, they're all modernized basically. Engines refitted, armor changed, armor layout and schemes changed, things like that. That's just so obviously to circumnavigate having to build anymore, because you can't, but then also at the same time sticking within the tonnage limit that you got and just making do with what you got and just updating them. So that means through the 20s and 30s, the big evolution that we have is cruisers, and it's all about treaty cruisers, and that's what makes it really interesting, because that's where the testbed of quite a lot of new technologies are done, but it's where you see the majority of the circumventing of the treaties, I guess you could say. I mean, you do see some lovely circumventing of the treaties in like things like the French submarines with 6-inch guns on them and things like that. These kind of things are obviously captured in the later Second London Treaty, where things like submarines with cruiser turrets on are kind of like ruled out. But what we see of cruisers is we see things like the Furitaka kind of evolve into the Obo class, and you've got the Mayuku class. So you can see that the Japanese obviously improving their 8-inch cruiser. So you can look at the Furitaka, it's got 6 single gun turrets. Then you can look at the Obo and it's got 3 dual gun turrets. Then you can look at the Mayuku and you can see we've gone up to 5 dual gun turrets. So considering those step changes, and apparently these are all within the 10,000 ton limit, but let's be honest, the Mayuku did turn out to be 20% more than the actual limits, and so they kind of swept under the carpet, you can tweak a few figures. And then there's other things like, say, the Megami class, where they were built with 6-inch guns, but then they also built some 8-inch gun turrets and kept them in a warehouse. So that means when they knew they were going to be going to war, you just popped out the 6-inch gun turrets, popped in the 8-inch gun turrets, and there you go, you got yourself a nice heavy cruiser. So what they did was they made a light cruiser with 6-inch guns, but so the hull was all about having the capability to have 8-inch guns, to have the speed and the armour for 8-inch guns, but for some reason it had 6-inch gun turrets, which looked a bit odd, and then suddenly as soon as it needed to, pop them off, pop them in. Then you've got other things like the Americans they start with the Pensacola class. That's their first treaty cruiser. Pensacola's got issues with being slightly top heavy, hence things like torpedoes are removed. But, they get their head in the game as it goes along with the Northampton class and things like that. And then the British, you got quite a mix. They can do some very light cruisers like the Leander class. They can do some very big light cruisers like the Town class. I mean, you can look at Edinburgh and you can see that she's got some girth on her. Really, she's quite a big treaty cruiser. She may be a little over. And then you've got also, I mean, no one's got a clean slate when it comes to this. Everyone's tweaked it a bit, cheated a little bit, lied a little bit, but they're all trying to look like they're abiding by the treaty. So things like the British Royal Navy County class heavy cruisers, which were really lightly armoured, and then a bit like with the Japanese in the Mogami class, when war looked like it's on the horizon or war had commenced, you just added some extra armor plate in some convenient places so you could up armor them. So yeah, there's little things like this. And as always, I guess what you can say about treaty is a treaty is only going to be worth the paper it's written on as long as there's peace. Because as soon as there's a war, what's the point in the treaty? You can just tear it up and build what you want. And then there's always something to always bear in mind is that the Axis powers, like Germany, so some of you are probably thinking, well, how the hell did they get the Deutschland class? Because that's 11-inch guns. Basically Germany was restricted by the Treaty of Versailles, and the Treaty of Versailles didn't put a limitation on the size of gun caliber. It put a limitation on how long it could be. Basically they couldn't build a new ship unless it was replacing a ship of the same class or something that was at least 20 years old. So that meant that they had to wait a while, and then as soon as available, they could then decommission a very old ship and then introduce a new ship like the Deutschland classes, which were, their image was supposed to be coastal battleships, but at the end of the day they turned out to be converse raiders. So that makes the cruisers in World of Warships Legends quite interesting, because you have quite a large mix of the treaty cruisers from tier 5 up to tier 7, and also you capture some of the treaty cruisers down at tier 4 like the Fair Attacker. Now there is the second London Naval Treaty, but this doesn't really do too much. And then, but that does add things like limits on destroyers and things like that. But it's so late in the day, 1936, that war's only 3 years away, and as soon as the war kicks off, the treaties are torn up. And anyway, Italy and Japan have already torn up the treaties and said, nah, bugger it, we're not doing this anymore. We're just going to do our own thing. And that's kind of like how Yamato's built. She's built in a warehouse that no one can see, and the plans are never released, and no one ever knows that she's got 18-inch guns until after the Second World War. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this. It's been just a quick review, I hope. In the background there's just been a bit of World of Warships Legends footage, hopefully some images or gameplay of the ships that we've just been talking about. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, give it a thumbs up. If you like this kind of content, feel free to subscribe. I'm the Gallop Major, and back to the port.